time is up. Please hand your quizzes in towards the end of each row. Please hand your quizzes in towards the end of each row. Either end, it's okay. Stop writing. Please stop writing. Time is up. So let me very quickly go through the drill of what's going to happen. In about 2 minutes, the TAs will come in with the quizzes from the other class. Okay, in a couple of minutes what will happen is the TAs from the other class will come in with the other quizzes. It will be alphabetically sorted by the time this class is over, and then when I get back to my office I will start grading, and I will keep grading till I stop grading, which hopefully will be when all the last quiz is done. When the last, come on in. Okay. When the last quiz is done, here's what I will do. I will put the quizzes out outside rather than have them in my office, because there is no way 325 people will be able to make it into my office before the break. And I can't hand it out in class because that will be a whole class. I will put the quizzes out face down. That's why I asked you to write your name on the back in alphabetical order. Okay? Which effectively means that if you know where your name is in the alphabetical order, you should be able to find it pretty quickly. Do not browse. These are not your quizzes to browse through. Just pick your quiz and leave, right? Do not put those quizzes out of alphabetical order, and or I will find you and make you pay, because that's a complete mess. So I will try to make it easy for you. I'll put it in 3 piles in alphabetical order so you can get your quiz out. You will get an email from me the minute the quizzes are done with the solution attached to it. I will not put the solution up till I finish grading your quiz, because otherwise you're going to look at the solution and develop worst case scenarios in your head, which I don't want to deal with. Right? So I will put the solution up, and I will also put the grade distribution up, not the mean and the median, the entire histogram of grades. Just remember, it's only 10% of your grades in either direction. So if you get a perfect score, chill. It's only 10%. You're not there yet. If you got a 0 on the quiz, chill again. It's only 10%. What happens to your worst quiz? It goes away. So go into your spring break with a light heart saying, I got a 0, it's okay, right? So, but hopefully nobody should have got a 0. First, were there any surprises on the quiz, you think? Okay. I don't think so. I think this quiz basically was exactly what I promised you, which is on the material. Let me pick one problem and ask you the answer, because I'll pick the easiest one. 2A. What was the risk-free rate? What did you get? 4.75. What did you get? You got 3.5. One of you has to be... Actually, by now you should probably realize there were two versions of the quiz. There were there have always been two versions of this quiz. The person, and they were sorted so that no two people setting... So if you copied from your neighbor, you are in deep trouble now, because you have the perfect solution to the wrong quiz, and that is impossible to explain away. You can claim to be psychic. It's not flying, right? In fact, I've been accused of being tricky for doing this. What's so tricky about it? You have one quiz in front of you. Do the damn quiz, right? I'm not giving you two quizzes to do. So there are two versions of the quiz. There are two versions of the quiz. They were exactly of equivalent difficulty, because the only thing I changed in the two quizzes were the numbers. In fact, for the second problem, I didn't even change the number. All I did was I made one company a Polish company and asked you to do everything in zlotys, and the other company a Hungarian company and asked you to do everything in foreign. So you cannot say the other person got an easier quiz. You have exactly the same quiz. Okay? So I will let you know as soon as the quizzes are done. It will be sooner than you think. It will definitely be before you leave for spring break. In fact, it will definitely be before you come back for your next class, which is Wednesday. So you will find your quiz, pick it up, take a look at it. Do not go to the TAs if you have a problem with the grading, because it's my fault. Okay? So if you have an issue with the grading, so when I put up the solution, I'll also put up my grading template on what I take points off for. Just check it against the template. If I've screwed up in any way, bring the quiz in, I'll fix it. Right? So any questions on the mechanics of the quiz? So I'll let you know as soon as it's done. Alphabetical order, face down, pick up your quiz. We're all set, right? Okay, so let's pick up where we left off on Wednesday. It's kind of tough to kind of get back into class after a quiz. Just let it go, right? We talked about the cost of equity. In fact, everything we've talked about so far has been coming up with the cost of equity. Risk-free rate, beta, equity risk premium, all designed to get a cost of equity. But equity is one of two ways you can raise funding for a company, right? We haven't talked about debt at all so far in the class. We haven't talked about what should go into it, how to attach a cost to it. So today what I'd like to do is complete that other half of the equation. Talk about what should go into debt and what the cost of debt is. And this is a far simpler exercise, because what's the question you're asking? What would I lend to this company at? What interest rate would I charge to lend to this company? So let me start off with a question that we need to get answered if we're going to bring debt into the equation. We have to be very clear about what we're going to include in debt, right? That sounds like a trivial question. You're saying, why don't you just look at the balance sheet? If it were only that simple. Because what you see as debt on a balance sheet might not be reflective of what a company is actually borrowing. You're going to see in a few minutes what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about some mysterious off-balance sheet financing. I'm just talking about the fact that accountants routinely miss big debt items because of how they're categorized. So I'm going to give you three criteria that I go looking for to classify something as debt. And as I go through these three criteria, listen carefully, because then I'm going to throw items from a balance sheet at you, and I'd like you to tell me whether they meet the criteria for debt. Okay? So here are the three things I look for to classify something as debt. First, it has to give rise to a contractually fixed commitment. You're saying as opposed to what? When I issue shares, do I make a commitment to you? I'll say, well, I'll pay you a dividend, but only if I can. It's not contractual, it's not fixed, so if I don't pay a dividend, you can't sue me. Or you can, but you're not going to get any money out of that lawsuit. So it's got to be contractually set and fixed. It doesn't have to be the same payment. If you have a floating rate bond, the payments can be different, but it's contractually set up front. Second, that payment in most of the world is tax deductible. There are parts of the world, like the Middle East, where it might not be. But in most of the world, that contractually fixed payment is tax deductible. And third, if you fail to make that payment, bad things happen to you. Like what? If you borrow from a money lender, your knees might get broken, but if you're a company, you're going to go bankrupt or default. Fixed payment, tax deductible, loss of control of your enterprise. You ready? I'm going to throw items at you, and you tell me whether they meet the criteria for debt. Corporate bonds. Obviously, right? Long-term bank loans, short-term bank loans. You see why I'm distinguishing between the two? Because I've seen investment banks do cost of capital, they count only long-term debt, which I've never understood the rationale. What are you telling me? If I borrow, take on a 6-month loan, I don't have to pay it? All interest-bearing debt is a slam dunk. It's definitely debt. So go down the balance sheet, short-term borrowing, long-term, any interest-bearing debt automatically is debt. Now let's go to the trickier items. How about accounts payable? What criterion doesn't it meet? It doesn't have an interest payment, I heard. That's true. It doesn't have an explicit interest payment, right? You see what I mean by explicit? How do you get supplier credit? You buy something from a supplier, he says you can pay me in 3 days, you can pay me in 60. But he's not stupid, right? To get you to pay in 3 days, what does he offer you? He offers you a discount. The implicit interest expense on supplier credit is that discount that you lose. If you're willing to tell me how much that discount is, you can count accounts payable and supplier credit as debt, but then you've got to figure out what that interest lost was. And you know how difficult that is to get? I mean, I get emails from people who are valuing companies where accounts payable and supplier credit are really big, and they want to count them as debt. They feel this urge to count them as debt. Can I count it as debt? I say, sure. As long as you can go into the cost of goods sold, because that's where it's hidden, and tell me how much of these discounts you lost by using supplier credit. Next day I get an email back saying, I've changed my mind. Accounts payable and supplier credit are not debt, but be very clear about why they're not debt, because the interest expense on them is not made explicit. If they were made explicit, I would have no qualms about counting them as debt, but because they're not made explicit, I'm not going to count those. So no accounts payable, no supplier credit. How about deferred taxes and all the rest of the deferred nonsense you see on a balance sheet? The accountant might dance and say this is all, but it's not debt. Deferred taxes in particular is one of those great fictions that only accountants understand. And it's a fiction because if you liquidated the firm today, you don't owe that money to the IRS today. This is an accountant saying, hey, you might owe more in taxes in the future. Thank you for letting me know. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to count it as debt. Do not feel this urge to count everything as debt. Part of you says, I want to be conservative. You're actually going to cut against your mission if you start counting everything as debt and keep pushing up your debt ratio. So no accounts payable, no supplier credit, no deferred taxes, no deferred salaries, which means a big chunk of the liabilities are not going to be counted as debt. You're saying, where are they going to go? Don't worry. We will bring them into the analysis elsewhere through the cash flows. But when you think about debt on a balance sheet, it's going to be interest-bearing debt. But here's where it gets tricky. Remember those 3 criteria I gave you? There are items off the balance sheet that meet those criteria that should be on the balance sheet, but for whatever reason, accounting for 60 years has struggled with what to do with these items. Now I'll give you a clue. You take Target or Walmart or the Gap. Think about how they grow. They don't grow anymore, but if they grow, what do? They open a new store, but they don't own the store mostly. They lease the store, right? A typical lease contract for the Gap runs 12 years with a mall. So here's what the contract says. You'll pay $1 million every year for the next 12 years. Fixed payment? Yeah. Tax deductible? Yes. What happens if you fail to make that payment? Initially, you lose that leasehold, but if you fail on a bunch of leases at the same time, you go bankrupt. That's how Caldor and Bradley's 2 discount retailers in the U.S. went bankrupt. They failed on a bunch of leases at the same time. This is a no-brainer. Lease commitments are always debt. I don't care whether the accountants classify them as operating leases and capital leases, because their classification is based on something that I think makes no sense. You know what determines whether something is a capital lease or an operating lease in an accounting statement? Somebody's an accountant, help me out. I've never understood this kind of, you've got to get the accounting mindset going. What is it?
If you can distinguish between the lease and owning it.
Ownership, exactly. The key word is ownership, which is if you're going to own the asset at the end of it, then it's a capital lease. If you don't, then it's an operating lease, to which my response is, I don't care. It might change the way I think about the risk in this asset. Maybe it takes the real estate risk out of my stores, but the commitment is still there. So accountants can do all the dancing they want between operating and capital leases, but from a financial perspective, all lease commitments should be debt. Remember I invited the accounting roundtable that I think one of you actually showed up at? You didn't miss much. It was excruciatingly boring. But in fact, there was a document there that said in 1949, accountants were debating whether to treat leases as debt. 1949. In 2014, accountants are debating whether to treat leases as debt. Now, this is why we don't wait for accountants to come to their senses. Just do it now, because if you know what the commitments are, you can do it yourself. So when we think about debt, it should include all interest-bearing debt and all contractual fixed commitments. Lease is the most common example, but I'll give you a couple of other examples of these kinds of commitments that we should be treating as debt. So that's what we're going to count as debt. Let's talk about the other half of the equation. What's the cost of debt? I'll give you what I'm trying to estimate, and then we'll talk about how to go about doing it. The cost of debt, as I see it, for a company, is the rate at which that company can borrow long-term today. Two key words there, long-term and today. First, let me explain why I threw the long-term in there. If I let a company get its cost of debt from the debt that it actually has on its balance sheet, given that term structures are upward sloping, short-term debt is cheaper than long-term debt. You know what's going to happen if I let companies tell me what debt they took on for the cost of debt? They're going to borrow a lot of short-term debt. They're going to come up with this really low cost and say, hey, my cost of debt is only 1%. To which my response is, you take on 1-year debt. That's got to get rolled over into 2-year, 3-year, 4-year, 5-year debt. I'm not going to give you credit for playing the term structure. So all of your debt, short-term or long-term, I'm going to attach a long-term cost. You're saying, how long-term? What do we use as our risk-free rate in the cost of equity? The 10-year rate. So I'm going to stay consistent with that. If I used a 30-year rate in my cost of equity, I'd go to 30-year debt. And that's one reason I didn't go with the 30-year rate, because it's much tougher to come up with a 30-year corporate bond rate. So if it's a 10-year rate, I'm going to go with the 10-year cost. Yeah. We'll come back to that. Those are hybrids, which are part debt, part equity, and we have to decide what to do with them. Convertible debt and preferred stock are common examples, but we'll come back to this. For the moment, let's deal with the extremes. So it's a long term. And what's the other word that I use? Today. You know why I put that in? Don't show me the debt you have on your balance sheet. Don't show me the bank loan you took 3 years ago. It doesn't matter. It's the rate at which you can borrow money today. So let's play a game. I'm a borrower, you're a bank. Because remember, banks still account for 70% of the debt. Doesn't have to be a bondholder, you're a bank. I come to you to borrow money long term, right now in US dollars. So you start building up to an interest rate you're going to charge me, because that's going to be my cost of debt. What's the base from which you're going to build off? You're going to start with the risk-free rate, because you'd be crazy to lend to me at less than the risk-free rate, right? So you're going to start with the risk-free rate, which right now is, let's say, 2.25%. It went up on Friday. I told you this number would keep shifting on you, and it is. So 2.25% as a base. You're going to add something to it, right? Because there's some default risk in me, not because the US government is better run than I am, but because I don't have a printing press in my basement. Let's face it, that's what makes governments default free. Apple is a much better run entity than the US government, but Apple doesn't have a printing press. So you're going to add a spread to it. How much the spread will be will depend on how much credit risk you see in me, right? That's it. It's no more complicated than that. This has been the way sensible banks have always lent money. You look at a borrower, you say, what is the chance this guy will not pay me back? You add a default spread or a credit spread. If I can come up with that credit spread, I'm home free. That's my cost of debt, risk-free rate plus that credit spread. Of course, the government then bends the rules a little bit for me, because when I pay 5% as an interest rate, they say, hey, you know what? We'll allow you to claim it as a tax deduction. So you get a tax benefit from that debt, but that's easy to take care of because I take out the effect of that tax benefit. I come up with an after-tax cost of debt. In doing all of this, though, make sure that the currency choice you made when you did cost of equity, you stay consistent with. Do you see what I mean by currency choice? What did I say I was going to do with Vale? I was going to do everything in US dollars. So I estimated the cost of equity in US dollars, right? When I get to the cost of debt, I can't say, well, Vale borrows everything in real, so I'm going to use a real cost of debt. It doesn't match up. So if I decide to use a US dollar cost of equity, my cost of debt also has to be in US dollars. Otherwise, I can't come up with a cost of capital with two different currencies floating around. So let's talk about how to get that default spread. Let's take the easy way out first. Let's see if we can outsource it. Maybe somebody else will do it for us. And there are a couple of thousand companies where it is fairly simple to outsource the measurement of default risk. There are entities out there that claim that this is their specialty, right? That they assess default risk better than the rest of us. We're talking about Moody's and S&P and Fitch, the ratings agencies. If you take them at their word, because they claim to have these mysterious magical processes for estimating default risk, you take the ratings that they assign, which have an alphabet attached to them, right? AAA all the way down to D, and you use that rating to come up with the default spread. So I took my 5 companies, and 3 of them have S&P ratings. So there's the ratings. Disney is rated single A, Deutsche Bank is rated single A, Vale is rated A minus. These are 3 very simple costs of debt to get, because if you tell me the rating for your company and I trust the ratings agency, that's a big if, then I can take the rating and tell you what the default spread should be based on the rating, because there are bonds out there with single A ratings, and the default spread on those bonds in November of 2013 was 1%. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take the 1%, add it on to my risk-free rate, and I'm going to come up with the cost of debt in US dollars. Remember, the risk-free rate was 2.75% in November of 2013, the T-bond rate. You add the 1%, I'm done, that's it. The pre-tax cost of debt for Disney as a company is 3.75%. So for those of you with companies where you can find a bond rating for your company, your cost of debt just got done. You just take the rating, you look up the default spread for it, and you've got a cost of debt for the company. For Deutsche, because I'm doing everything in euros, I added the same 1% default spread, but I added it to the euro risk-free rate, which was 1% lower in November of 2013. So my cost of debt for Deutsche is 2.75%. For Vale, I took the A minus rating that S&P gave them, took the default spread with that rating, 1.3%, added it on to my 2.75% T-bond rate, because I'm doing everything in US dollars, to come up with a cost of debt of 4.05%. Saying, what if I change my mind and do everything in reais? It's easy, right? Because remember how we converted a dollar cost of equity to nominal real cost of equity? Give me the inflation difference. In this case, the inflation difference is 9% in reals and 2% in dollars. And I can convert the 4.05% US dollar cost of debt into 11.19% nominal real cost of debt. So if you have a rating, you can use the rating to come up with the default spread. You're saying, where do I look up the default spreads? I'll give you a way of doing that fairly simply in a few minutes. But with the rating, the default spread kind of falls out. The cost of outsourcing your default risk, of course, is that the ratings agencies could be wrong. So I'll give you a way in which you might be able to at least check to see whether the ratings agencies are using their census. In fact, this is the approach you should use. If you don't find a rating for your company, a lot of your companies, you will not be able to find a bond rating. It's not the end of the game. Be a ratings agency for about 15 minutes. And trust me, it's not that complicated. About 20 years ago, when I first started looking at ratings, I asked a follow-up question. How do ratings agencies come up with these ratings? What do they look at? And actually, they gave away the game. They gave away the game because they gave me the rating for every company that they rated. And if you go to the S&P website, they list 9 ratios that they claim that they use to rate companies. Ratios like fixed charges ratio, debt ratio. So you can see the ratios. So here's what I did about 20 years ago. I took the rating for every rated company. I took the 9 ratios they claim to use, put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and did some reverse engineering. You know what I mean by reverse engineering? I sorted the companies based on ratings and tried to figure out, based on the ratios, whether I could guess the ratings. And here's what I found, and might not be the right answer, but that's what I found by looking at the data. 8 of the 9 ratios seem to be doing nothing. They were there for noise. And that's always the scenario. When you're a quant shop and you're using one number, you got to cover up the fact that you're using one number by throwing 35 other numbers into the mix. So that didn't surprise me. The one ratio that seemed to be doing the bulk of the heavy lifting here was the interest coverage ratio. Saying, what the heck is that? It's the operating income divided by the interest expense. Now remember, this is not the ratio that I'm saying is the best ratio. This is the ratio that seems to best explain differences in ratings across non-financial service companies. We'll come back to banks and insurance companies later, but if you give me a non-financial service company, if I compute this ratio, I can pretty much guess what rating you would get for a company. So let's try this for all 5 of my companies, including the 3 that have ratings. Let's see how close I get using this process. I took the operating income in the most recent year. And you can take issues with that. Maybe you should average it out. Okay, there are finessing that you can do here, but I took the operating income divided by the interest expense for each company. So if I did that for Disney, the interest coverage ratio I get is 22.57. What does that mean? If you've lent money to Disney, for every dollar in interest expenses, they're generating $22.57 in operating income. You're not lying awake at night saying, am I going to get paid back, right? The lower that number, the more worried you get. The more worried you get, the lower the rating. That's basically the intuition here. I do that for Vale, for Tata Motors, for Baidu, for Bookscape. I don't do it for Deutsche. You know why? Because remember what I said about Deutsche. I don't even know what debt is for Deutsche. I don't even know what interest expenses are. Should I be counting the interest expenses on deposits that customers make at banks? Technically I should, right? So I'm not even going to go there. But for the non-financial service companies, I come up with the coverage ratios. So here's my task. If I can somehow convert these coverage ratios for each of these companies into a bond rating for each company, I'm home free, right? So remember that 20 years ago I said I had this big Excel spreadsheet with the ratings and the ratios, and I found that one ratio seemed to be doing the trick. Here's how I decided to use the data. I decided to take that data and create a lookup table in Excel. Do you know what a lookup table is? Basically, you tell me the coverage ratio for a company. I'll try to guess the rating based on how the ratings agencies are rating companies. And every 2 or 3 years since, I've gone back and finessed that table based on looking at the actual ratings and the ratios. So this is my lookup table. And of course, they're going to be it's simplistic. I'm basing it on one ratio. But you tell me what the ratio for a company is. I'm going to go to this lookup table and I'm going to look up that ratio. But I did notice something when I was looking at the ratings for companies that had ratings. I noticed that large market cap companies were cut a lot more slack than small market cap companies. Cut a lot more slack in what sense? GM would have had a D rating if it had not been GM. So small companies seem to get much lower ratings for the same interest coverage ratio. You can say that's unfair. Maybe this is the ratings agency's version of saying too large to fail. That somebody will bail you out if you're a really big company, and it's going to show up as a higher rating. So with each company, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to first look up your market cap. That should be easy, right? So market value of equity. If it's greater than 5 billion, I'm going to use the large cap company table. If it's less than 5 billion, or if you're an emerging market company, I'm going to use a small market cap. Why if you're an emerging market company? Because again, ratings agencies seem to have 2 sets of rules. So let's start with Disney. Market cap of about 70, no, more than that, 100 and something billion. Large market cap, easily. Developed market company, so I can go with the large cap. Its interest coverage ratio is 22.57 on the previous page. I go to the table. That's way above 8.5, so I give it a AAA rating. Part of you saying, but it's not AAA rated. Okay, let it go. It's okay, right? So you haven't used it yet. Just you got a synthetic. That's called a synthetic rating. I call it synthetic, just to protect myself from legal action. Because otherwise, because we own the ratings, you can't do that. So call it something. Call it. Give it your name. Dash rating. You're a ratings agency for the moment. Okay? If they make a big deal about it being the same alphabets they're using, switch to the Greek alphabets. It'll actually look even more impressive because everything looks like it's in default. Right? But so I'm sorry, that's a low blow against the Greeks, but no, you know what I mean. Right? So that's Disney. I've got a AAA rating. Let's take Vale. Large market cap company, emerging market company. So I'm going to go with the small cap table. Their interest coverage ratio was 11.67. You go to the second table. 11.67 is between 9.5 and I give them a AA rating. Is everybody clear on what I'm doing? So essentially you're saying why are there two ratings? The first is a Moody's rating. The second is an S&P rating. You can pick either. It doesn't matter. So I've got a rating for Vale. For Tata Motors, large cap emerging market company, interest coverage ratio is much lower, 4.51. I go in there. They barely make it. And it's very important because that 4.51 gives them a rating just above investment grade. Investment grade is at BBB, so I give them an A- rating. If their interest expenses had been 50 million more, they'd have actually become a BBB rated company. Baidu, small cap emerging market company, interest coverage ratio of 23.72. Here again, you're probably going to say, no way will Baidu ever get a AAA. Don't worry about it. In a few minutes, you're going to see why it's not going to matter that much that you've overrated the company. Okay? And finally, for Bookscape, it's not even a publicly traded company. Obviously, it's a small company. It's a private business. I still use the interest coverage ratio with the small cap companies to come up with a rating of A-. So the way the table gets developed is by using rated companies. But I'm using the table to rate unrated companies. I'm essentially saying if these companies were rated using the same rules as those other rated companies are, what rating would I assign them? Now, 3 of these companies had an actual rating, right? So once I got my synthetic rating, I said, let's see how close I got, and if I didn't get close, what might explain it? Let's start with Disney. My synthetic rating was AAA, right? Their actual rating was single A. So if you think about why might these two numbers be different, what did I use to get my interest coverage ratio? I used the operating income in 2013, which was a very good year for Disney. And if you're a ratings agency or a lender, you don't want to lend on a best year, you want to lend on a normal year. In fact, that might be something I should have done right from the beginning. Rather than use last year's operating income, if I'd used an average of 5 years, maybe I'd have got more sensible ratings. But one reason for the difference is I'm putting everything on last year's income and the ratings agency is looking at across time. Second, the ratings agency does use all that other stuff, right? Including qualitative information. They can ask a company for specific information that I cannot ask about. So they can ask, how's Frozen actually doing? Or what about that Lone Ranger 2? How far along is it? Things I cannot ask, and that can enter my rating. So with a heavy heart, I'm going to abandon my synthetic rating for Disney and say, you know what, the ratings agency probably knows a little bit more about Disney than the interest coverage ratio I'm using. So when I compute the cost of debt for Disney, I will use the actual rating. There have been cases with companies where I've actually gone with my synthetic rating because I cannot explain why the ratings agency has the rating that it does. And sometimes you might arrive at that conclusion. You might say, if the ratings agency is irrationally exuberant, because like everybody else, they can get caught up in the mood of the moment, and maybe you need to step back and be the sober one here and say, you know what, my rating here has to be a little lower to reflect the fact that this is an oil company and oil prices are not going to stay at $150 a barrel for the rest of eternity. So that's Disney's rating and why it's different. I'm trying to explain my synthetic to actual rating, and I think that is the best explanation I can offer you for Disney. Yes?
Doesn't the interest coverage ratio have interest expense which is past debt, which we didn't want to use in the first place?
Well, that's your actual payment, all right? So in a sense, your default risk is reflective of that to the extent that that debt is coming due. And the interest rate on the new debt might be higher. You can replace it with a forward-looking interest expense and a forward-looking operating income. The approach is completely agnostic about what EBIT and what interest expense I use. It doesn't have to be last year's. I chose to use last year's, but you can replace both numbers with what you think are numbers going forward, and that might give you a much more sensible rating. Now for Vale, my actual rating was A-, my synthetic rating was AA, but here I think there's a much simpler explanation for why the ratings agency has a much lower rating. Vale is a Brazilian company. You're saying, so what? Until about 1999, maybe even a little later, ratings agencies had what was called a sovereign rating ceiling on companies. You know what that meant? That no company in a country was allowed to have a rating higher than the country it was incorporated in. Imagine being an Argentine company, right? or a Greek company. You could be the safest Argentine company, and they'd say, you know what, single B. We say, but look at my cash, I'm all cash. It doesn't matter, you're single B. It was an incredibly bludgeoned rule, if you think about it. And they did relax it a little bit, but it does still enter into the ratings process. And it's realistic, right? You're a Greek company, you walk into a bank and say, I'd like to borrow money. What does the banker say? 35% plus. You haven't even shown them the financials yet, but that's the nature of the process. Your sovereign standing can affect your default risk. So there, I think the biggest difference is country risk. It's been incorporated into the rating. I didn't do it. And finally, for Deutsche, I just have an actual rating. I don't have a synthetic rating. I'm not even going to try to explain. There, I'm kind of at the mercy of the ratings agencies having done their job right. But it's going to turn out that with Deutsche, I don't even need a cost of debt because I'm not going to attach a debt and a debt ratio and a cost of capital. I'm just going to stay with the equity. Now, I'm going to use that rating to come up with the cost of debt. So I took my companies, and for Bookscape, all I had was a synthetic rating. I stayed with it. The default spread based on the synthetic rating was 1.3%. Added to the risk-free rate, I get a pre-tax cost of debt of 4.05%. Now let me take a pause. I said that debt does give you an advantage, right? What's the advantage of debt? That interest is tax deductible. Have any of you used TurboTax this year to do your taxes? You have no income? You still have to file taxes. You do know that, right? Okay? So if you have no income, don't go to H&R Block. What are you going to show them? I have no income, do my taxes? You can still get, I think, something back from the government for your tuition, maybe. But I just finished my taxes, and it's a deeply depressing weekend of my life. It's like the lost weekend of the year. So you do your taxes, and if I have interest expenses, which unfortunately I don't have very much of, tell me how it works with your taxes. Let's say you have, I don't want to insult you by putting too low a number, 5 million in income. Is that okay? If you're insulted, just add a zero to it, 2 zeros, whatever you need to do. You have 5 million in income and $500,000 in interest expenses. So what do you report as taxable income? 500,000 minus 5 million, I was already starting to knock zeros off. 5 million minus 500,000, which is 4.5 million, right? Think of where interest saved you taxes. It saved you on the last $500,000 in income. You're saying, who cares? So the tax rate you should be using for your tax saving is the marginal tax rate, the tax rate on the last dollar of income you had. If you're a US company, that marginal tax rate is going to be 35% plus. Why 35%? Because the federal corporate tax rate is 35%. You have state taxes, local taxes. By the time you add them all up, KPMG estimates you're at about 40%. But you're saying, but what if it's a multinational that has income in lower tax locales? You're a multinational, you borrow money. Where should you keep the money? Where you get the maximum tax benefit, right? So when Apple borrowed money, it didn't park it in Ireland. That would be absolutely stupid. It didn't leave it in Singapore. It borrowed in the US. So here's the great irony of taxes. If you're a multinational, you might pay a lower effective tax rate because you have income across the world, but your debt gets you the maximum tax benefit because it's going to be placed in your highest tax locale. So if you're a US company, your marginal tax rate is going to be 40%. For Bookscape, that's what I used as my tax rate. In fact, it's a little worse for Bookscape because this guy is an individual. How many of you plan to work in New York when you're done with your MBA? I'm going to depress you completely. Let's start to work out what your marginal tax rate is going to look like if you work in New York. You ready? Presumably you hope to make a lot of money. That's why you came back to business school. So what's your federal marginal tax rate going to be if you get up above 450,000? 39%. So that's your starting point. It's actually a little worse than that because you have to pay, Medicare. So it's about 41%. But you're not done. That's just your federal tax rate. You're in New York State. You know the marginal tax rate in New York State is? 8.5%. Okay. Is it 7, 8? It's been dropped. It was 8.5% when I did it yesterday. Maybe TurboTax is cutting off a little off the top and taking it for themselves, right? So 41, you get a little state tax deduction, so I'll give you that break, so you're at about 46, 47% with state taxes. You plan to live in the city, right? I mean, that's why you work in New York. You don't plan to live in Hoboken. I mean, that gets you no cachet outside in the rest of the world. I live in Hoboken, so where is Hoboken? Right? But here's the price you pay for living in New York City. There's a city tax, which is about 3.5. I think it's 3.5. I haven't lived in New York City in a long time. So that's so you're up to about 50, 51%. When you look at your first paycheck, it is going to horrify you. You thought you were being paid $8,000 a month, and you get back $4,225. In fact, the first couple of months when you have Social Security taxes, taking another 7% off the top, you're probably going to be ending up with 46% of your income, 47. This is why you should move to Hong Kong. Reconsider working in New York City, right? Because in Hong Kong it's 15%. But if you borrow money in Manhattan to buy that Central Park West condo that you've been having your eye on for the last 25 years, this is the plus. This is the only place it helps you to live in New York City. Every dollar in interest expense you have in New York City will save you 51 cents in taxes, because it is saving you taxes at the margin. So that's what you're looking for, not the effective tax rate, not the average tax rate, but the marginal tax rate. So that's my after-tax cost of debt. For Disney, Deutsche and Vale, I went with the S&P rating, saying, hey, they know more than I do. Because those ratings already reflect country risk, I could basically ignore country risk here. I get the default spread. I use the marginal tax rate. And I did stay with the marginal tax rate domestically for each of these countries, even though you could argue that if Vale has enough income in Canada or the US, it's actually got to be in the US, because the Canadian tax rate is not that much higher than Brazil. Then it can claim it'll try to borrow money in the US and claim the interest expenses here. But those are the marginal tax rates in the US for Disney. It's lower than 40, because Disney actually breaks its marginal tax rate down. For Deutsche, it's 29.5%. That's a German marginal tax rate. And for Vale, it's 34%, which is the Brazilian marginal tax rate. So there's my after-tax cost of debt. 2 of those are in dollars. 1 of those is in euros. And finally, for Tata Motors, I started with the risk-free rate in India. And I added 2 default spreads. I seem to be changing the rules here, right? Because all the other costs of debt, I took the risk-free rate and added 1 default spread. For Tata Motors, I had 2 default spreads. One is the default spread for the company, the 0.75% that I got from the rating. The other is the default spread for the country. I'm doing what the ratings agencies used to do, which is effectively saying, if you're an Indian company and I compute a synthetic rating for you, then I have to factor in that when you go in to borrow money, the fact that you're an Indian company, an Indonesian company, is going to weigh in against you. Is that always going to be the case? If you have a commodity company, I might break the rules and say, you know what, I'm not going to attach the entire country risk to you. I'm going to give you less than that because you're less exposed in the country. But I'm going to start with that presumption that I have to factor in the cost of debt. You're saying, how come you didn't do it for Vale? Because I'm using an actual rating, which I'm assuming already reflects country risk. But because for Tata Motors the rating is a synthetic rating, I have to do the country risk adjustment myself. So that's my after-tax cost of debt. Now let me talk a little bit about that default spread. Until about 10 years ago, it used to take me about a day to come up with this table. If you gave me a rating, to look up the default spread, because here's what I had to do. For every rating, I had to go find 10 or 15 bonds with that rating, find the yields to maturity on those bonds, and average them out. Not a big deal, but it was tedious. About a decade ago, I found this site called bondsonline.com. It's still online. You can try it. And it was free. It was free. It's no longer free. And you could go on there, and they actually had updated default spreads by rating class. So this is actually from Bonds Online. The rating is on the left. You see the default spreads for 1-year bonds, 2-year bonds, 5-year bonds, 10-year bonds, all the way up to 30-year corporates. Updated every minute of every day. You're saying, this is great. Here's the catch. They now charge you $50 for a snapshot. What do you mean snapshot? In other words, if you want to look this up 20 times a day, it'll cost you 20 times $50, which is $1,000 a day. Please don't do that. You're not fixed income people. You really don't need the default spread every minute of every day. I look it up once every 3 months. I pay them the $50. I don't cheat them. And I put it on my website for the next 3 months. And I don't think that's cheating because the people who go to them want updated spreads. Anyway, they're fixed income people. So if you're really cheap, you can use the default spreads that are on my website because they're going to be okay till March 30th, at which point I'll update it and you'll have a new updated spread. But if you're in a hurry to get your project done, which I know some of you want to get it done over the spring break, you have plans for the entire week, go to bondsonline.com, check this table out, pay the $50. Each of you as a group has to pay in $10, I guess. But keep that in mind because once you get out there, you might want the default spread as of this moment, and you're only $50 away from getting it. Right? So try this for your company. Take the income statement, come up with the interest coverage ratio, come up with the synthetic rating based on the interest coverage ratio, and see if you can come up with an after-tax cost of debt. Okay? So essentially it's going through the process. Look to see whether they have an actual rating. So you can do what I did for Disney, but if they don't have an actual rating, try to go through the synthetic ratings process. I know you guys are ready to end, but I'm not. Right? I have a few more loose ends to tie up. So we talked about hybrids. So far I've talked about debt or equity, right? Hybrids have a little bit of each, and they're a pain in the neck. I'll give you the hybrid that's easier to deal with, convertible debt. You know how convertible debt works? Convertible debt is a bond that can be converted into stock. It's like there's an option plus a bond in a convertible debt. And it's neither debt nor equity because part of it is debt and part of it is equity. The part of it is that's debt is the bond. The conversion option is equity. Here's the best way to deal with convertible debt. If you have a convertible bond, take the debt portion, the bond portion, and throw it in with debt. Take the conversion option and throw it in with equity. Which means you've got to break a convertible bond into its two components, right? Which part is easier to value, the bond part or the option part? The bond is going to be easier to value, so don't go black scholes before you need to, right? Value the convertible bond as if it were a straight bond with no conversion option. You're going to come up with a price, right? Take the coupon rate, and because you take a Tesla convertible, which is like a 1% coupon rate, the bond portion is tiny, so that part is debt. Then subtract that from the market price of the convertible bond, and the rest becomes equity. Throw the equity in with that and the debt in with the debt, and it's gone. There's no more hybrid to deal with. That's the easy one. The pain in the neck security is preferred stock. Preferred stock, at least in the US, has the following characteristics. There's a fixed dividend. So that makes it look a lot, so it's almost contractually set, an 8% dividend. There's very little price appreciation. It's not like preferred stock in Latin America, which is really common shares without voting rights. Preferred stock in the US is very much like debt. In fact, if you don't pay the preferred dividend, often you have cumulative preferred stock. We have to collect the dividend and pay it in future years. So part of you says, let's treat it like debt, but it has one catch. Why can't I throw it in with debt? What's the problem I'm going to run into? It is not tax deductible. So if I throw it in with debt and put a 1 minus T on it, I'm acting like I'm getting it. It is incredibly inefficient debt. In fact, it's an absurd way to raise capital. So why do companies do it? What are the biggest users of preferred stock in the US? Banks. And you know why they use it? Because the regulatory authorities treat it as equity. It is an incredibly stupid way of financing that is fed by an incredibly stupid regulatory capital definition, which means you have banks like Citibank issuing preferred stock with 7% dividends when they don't have the cash to cover those dividends. And we've talked about the issue equity to cover the pay. It's an incredibly dysfunctional way to raise financing. But preferred stock is a pain. So here's what you need to do with preferred stock. First, look at the amount of preferred stock. If it's less than 5% of the value of the company, act like it's not there. Cross it out. So I don't see any preferred stock. Why make your life difficult? If it's more than 5%, open up a third front in your cost of capital. You have debt with the cost of debt, equity with the cost of equity, and your preferred stock with the cost of preferred stock. You're saying that's going to be so difficult. The cost of preferred stock is trivial. It's your preferred dividend yield. In other words, it's the dividend divided by the preferred stock price. You're done. It's going to be somewhere between your cost of equity and your pre-tax cost of debt, because that's where preferred stockholders fall. But if you have hybrids, don't leave them just hanging out there. Deal with them and move on, but don't let them paralyze you. So we'll stop there. When we come back, we'll complete this process of cost of capital. One more thing. If you've looked at your Google Calendar, you probably noticed there's a case that you should be getting today. It's on there. So I'll put it up in there. I'll send it by the email. So that case is due on April 1st. So you have lots of time for it. I just wanted to get it out to you in case you wanted to kind of get it started.
Meet you,